back there a couple minutes ago, guys, and it's just a reminder to renew your membership if you haven't done so, and if you haven't joined us, please consider doing so as well. The link is there. We did also kind of send out an email as well, so if you are a member, you should have received that email. If you didn't receive it, you probably need to renew your membership anyway, so just maybe check that. And there are a couple of different options for the membership fees as well, so just have a look on the website, because those memberships obviously really help STORK out a lot as well. Okay, so I'm going to kick off, and if there's a few more to join, I'll add them later on. So welcome everybody to the first journal club of the year. As I mentioned, we had the email newsletter went out recently, but we are actually also looking for a student representative to join the STORK Executive Committee as well. So if you know of anybody that may be interested in joining, or possibly you are interested yourself, please feel free to express interest. I've Michael's email there in the chat as well. As part of that email as well, we also mentioned that we plan on setting up a communication platform for STORK members, and that's just so that we can have some kind of more internal discussions, especially with the way Twitter and X has gone, and the hassle of setting up some social media platforms and things now as well. So that is, as I mentioned, going to be for members only. So just again, make sure you renew your memberships, and it just gives a chance to members to have a little bit more discussions, or potentially collaborate on projects as well, if there's any opportunities for those as well. So as you know, this journal club is going to be about our chapter 1 from the STORK Research Methods book, and this chapter, Foundations of Scientific Research in Sports and Exercise Science, is by James Steele, who is joining us today, and will be happy to answer all your questions on philosophy and guide you in the right direction. So I'll just give a quick summary of the chapter, and then we'll kind of open it up to the floor for a little bit more of an informal discussion about the chapter itself, any comments on it, and just, or even any of your own thoughts and your own philosophical positions as well. So the chapter starts by introducing the foundation of science and the philosophical backgrounds and the debates surrounding them, and it also kind of gives us a chance to reflect on our own positions. It kind of asks us why we should care about philosophy as sports and exercise science students and researchers, particularly, I guess, when there's no real discussion of it at the moment in our own research methods education, or I suppose a lot of sports and exercise science researchers may not have really had much time or thought about their philosophical standpoints at any point. We tend to consider it separate to our own scientific work. So I really like to quote from the chapter: "Without an understanding of the tools of philosophy, scientists are trained to be little more than technicians without an understanding of why they are doing what they do." So the chapter goes on to say that, you know, these, the kind of foundation of science and philosophical backgrounds are really important to try and provide a historical context to modern science. It can help students become kind of real seekers of knowledge and improve their skills at articulating scientific concepts and theories, and just in general help with kind of more theory building as well. So the chapter goes on to introduce the 4 main branches: ontology, the theory of being; epistemology, the theory of knowledge; axiology, including ethics and aesthetics, the theory of values; and logic, the theory of inference. So I'll just briefly describe what the chapter wrote about those. So first of all, with ontology, the chapter describes what there is to know about reality, how it is structured and what it is made up of, and how do they relate to one another. Essentially, what things are out there that we can obtain knowledge of. And in ontology, there are 2 opposing positions: realism versus anti-realism. A realist will assume that there is an objective answer to the basic question of what exists, that there's a universe filled with definable things outside of their independent own subjective experience. And then on the other hand, an anti-realist will deny there is a reality independent of our own subjective experience. In terms of epistemology, it's about understanding how you can come to obtain knowledge about the reality that you're trying to investigate. In epistemology, an objectivist assumes there is no barrier to the production of knowledge. It is just the case of making observations from reality. The subjectivist then is more skeptical and thinks observations and knowledge are influenced by a variety of things, and that the truth does not simply emerge in a neutral, objective manner. And then out of these, there's kind of the chapter describes 4 categories out of the combinations, and they kind of relate to 3 broad philosophical positions then: positivism, constructivism, and critical realism. So positivism is a combination of realism and objectivism. It's a mouthful, some of these words sometimes. So it takes the ontological stance that the world consists of real things and that we can gain objective knowledge about this reality, that there are facts and laws that describe reality, and we come to know them through a process of verification via empirical observation. The positivist doesn't need any explanation or does not consider deeper answer to questions such as why or how. The next one then, constructivism, is where both reality and scientific knowledge are human and social construction. That reality is influenced by experience, so there are many realities as there are subjective observers to experience them, so that there could be different observers could have different realities, and there could be multiple truths then as a result. Under this philosophical framework, knowledge is fallible. A statement that could claim truth may actually be wrong. The third then is critical realism, and this is kind of linked with Karl Popper, which a lot of people might have heard of. So this is where there is a reality independent of us observers, and it is the target of our research science. So before there were conscious beings who were capable of experiencing mental states, there were still other objective things. This position begins with a realist ontological position. The knowledge that we generate is of the things that we make up reality, but then in comes our empirical experiences and observations, as the knowledge is not free from our subjective discourses, meanings, experiences, and values. So this position embraces uncertainty and the fallibility of the knowledge that we produce. The chapter then goes on to discuss the axiology of science, so the theory of values, and kind of discusses then that the choices between scientific theories can be influenced by our values. So for example, ethics frequently influence research practices, and that our backgrounds and experiences can bias our actions as individual scientists, which is why we need to be transparent and embrace our philosophical positions and promote diversity in science. So Robert Merton's norms, the Mertonian norms, are a pretty famous example of that, but I really liked the intellectual values as well that were inserted in that chapter. I had not read those before. And finally then, the chapter goes on to discuss logic, reasoning, and inference. So it discusses deductive inference, inductive inference, and abductive inference. And then there are quite a few exercises throughout the chapter as well to help you consider your own position and then write your own philosophical position statement. So James provided his own statement, and there's also an exercise in that chapter as well to look at kind of the logic of already published sports and exercise science research and see, can you deem which type of logic they used, whether they used inductive, abductive, and deductive reasoning. So those were some nice little exercises. So the chapter kind of concludes then, lines us up nicely for a second chapter, which is going to be on kind of theory building and development as well. So as I mentioned, the chapter link for the preprint is in the chat there as well. So James is kindly looking for feedback on it. So please consider doing that if you haven't done so already. So I guess I'll kind of start with what I liked about the chapter, and I've already kind of mentioned a little bit of this to James as well, because I've given him some feedback on it. So I like that it's quite digestible. It's a really nice kind of introduction for me as a sports and exercise science student compared to other writings about philosophy, which can be a little bit overwhelming in a way. I do think the exercises throughout as well, particularly the reflective exercise on your own philosophical position, was quite nice, because I think there were kind of some really nice natural stops in the chapter that made you think about what you were reading rather than just reading the chapter for the sake of it to say that you have read it. I liked the inclusion of Paul Meal's little poem in the footnotes as well. That was a really nice one. And I just liked that, you know, throughout the chapter, James really encouraged you to be uncertain about your philosophical position and your assumptions as well. So there was a really nice piece in it. I'm going to take a quote here, that reflexivity is important to aid in understanding your positionality as a researcher. It refers to the conscious, active acknowledgement and appraisal of your beliefs, biases, and assumptions both before, during, and after the research process. So I really like that it's kind of encouraging you to embrace the subjectivity of your positioning, because of course you can't go out and test everything that you assume are true. And I like that, throughout the chapter, it's just kind of telling you that potentially your position could change over time with reflection or with experience, and that it's also okay to hold a belief but not have to try and prove it to someone as well. So yeah, they're just my initial thoughts on the chapter. So I'm going to open it up to everyone else here. So what did you all think of the chapter? Did it kind of cause you to reflect on your own position? If you haven't got a chance to read the chapter yet, have you any thoughts or comments kind of on your own positions? Or even James, you're free to jump in and kind of tell me what
Well,
kind
I
of
was going
started
to say, I thought
grounded.
that was a wonderful summary. So thanks for that, Jenny. Um, yeah, I mean, I I was interested to come along to the Journal Club Lab, not to spend too much time talking, but listening more so than anything else, and reflecting on how you have received the chapter. So yeah, I'm really genuinely interested in understanding how you perceive the chapter, whether it's been useful, what some of the weaknesses in it are. I'm very aware that I think there needs to be, although I feel like you're more prone to getting like positive feedback for stuff like this than people slamming it. So far I've only had relatively positive feedback and some fairly useful criticism, but nothing too harsh. So.
Mhm.
I've got thick skin. Feel free to be as harsh as possible. But
Mhm.
one of the points which I think I definitely, on reflection, am going to work on and revise a little bit before it goes to the final version of the textbook is to try and flesh out some additional sport and exercise related examples.
Mm.
And in fact, Israel Halperin had a really nice suggestion. And then, completely coincidentally, a couple of weeks ago, I came across a paper which basically was the perfect example of that suggestion, which was to maybe include kind of like a dialogue throughout, so a selection of kind of hypothetical researchers, and have kind of the kind of dialogues and discussions that they might be having from different positions philosophically that they take with regards to their research. And there was a very small point I made like early in the chapter where I gave the example of a behaviorist researcher receiving some criticism about not acknowledging kind of internal mental states, unobservable states that might influence people's behavior and choices and so on. As a fairly sort of offhand example, but I found a really nice paper a couple of weeks ago, which includes a dialogue between a behaviorist sports coach and a constructivist sports coach, and kind of highlights some of the disagreements that they may have when they don't openly acknowledge kind of the different positions that either are coming to, and try to kind of think, well, if I were to put myself in starting with those assumptions, where would that lead me to conclude things, and trying to understand things that way rather than just talking past one another. So I'm going to add that in for definite, and any other good examples people can think of, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I think the idea of including some sort of dialogue would be really nice, because I think it would just, like, sometimes, especially with my first reading of the chapter, because I said that to you, but I need sports science examples. I need sports science examples because I think sometimes you read this thing, you read it and you think, it doesn't really apply to my field because it's just not spoken about enough, or it's not like it's not part of your research methods education. We, like, in my research methods education, I learned absolutely nothing about building theories, or even even creating good hypotheses. Like, that was all completely alien. It was more about following a step-by-step process to how to run stats and SPSS. That was my research methods education. So there was no real kind of reflective type work in it throughout, and I think it's such a shame, because I did have a little bit of a laugh actually at one point in the chapter, where that exercise for the students, where you were like, what is it, to pick a paper and have a look and see what type of inference they were using. So you said, what is it, to Oh yeah, choose a scientific article or research paper that contains a clear and specific claim. I did have a little laugh at that because I was like, best of luck. And it's already confusing enough to try and like for a student who would be trying to do this type of exercise to try and understand the logical structure and figure out what type of inference was used, but to do it without a clear and specific aim would be a little bit more of a challenge as well. So I thought that was a little bit funny.
Yeah, there was a little bit sneaky ulterior motive in there to send people out to realize how infrequently clear kind of arguments are made in in the papers that we read.
Yeah,
So yeah,
that would be
I'm
nice
not
as
trying to
long as
make them
there's
too cynical.
as long as there'd be a reflection on that afterwards though, because I would think like even back like a couple of years when my early into my research methods education, if I was to undertake an exercise like that and like was struggling to find a clear and specific aim, I think I would have thought that was a problem with me and my reading,
Mm.
that I would have never have thought, oh, that's a problem of the authors in this published paper in a journal because it's published, it must be good, so it would be, I think, definitely really important to make sure that there is kind of some reflective time after that.
Yeah.
um I found kind of definitely in the kind of that section on logic, I think was actually the hardest for me a little bit to wrap my head around because you know I just don't think we ever kind of reflect on the type of inference or logic we're using, and then depending on the discipline or depending on the topic, sometimes you're kind of trying to use one or a combination of both and not realizing what's valid or invalid. So I thought that was kind of challenging.
Yeah, I think, and part of the aim of presenting that more kind of like holistic overview at the end to say like, look, it doesn't necessarily need to be one or the other. In fact, different forms of argumentation and logical forms can be more or less appropriate depending upon what the goals of your research are at whatever stage you're at in your research. And it links back to the ontological positionality as well, with regards to, the kinds of inference that you might use when drawing inferences about empirical observations, or whether you are using those to generalize to phenomena, effects, etc., that might be constant patterns, or in this context, you can think of it in the sense of replication. Do the effects replicate? Um,
Mm.
Almost independent of theory. And then with the application of kind of abduction, we start to then think of, how do we explain these phenomena and these data that we observe? And I kind of think that there is, when you read good kind of writing around the applications of philosophy of science, ideas within the philosophy of science to the practice of doing science as scientists. Maybe it's my bias, but the best writing doesn't tend to kind of pick one or the other, but presents how you can employ
Mm.
these different kind of argumentation forms in different stages and depending upon the goals of your current research. There's arguments we should be doing far more description and trying to do a better job of just describing and detecting phenomena that we can then start to build theories about. But we definitely don't do enough of that. And maybe that's because of the kind of historical baggage of, earlier disciplines, which are kind of sister disciplines to us, focusing very much on, the application of kind of deductive falsification and trying to
Mm.
sort of, employ that modus ponens kind of structure, and us kind of adopting these sorts of things in an unthinking manner as a kind of discipline. And that's not to say that that's not absolutely valuable in certain situations, but it's almost like in some cases the field's not quite there to be able to make
Yeah.
the best use of those kinds of tools, and we should be looking at different stages to try and employ other forms.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, it's like, especially with falsification, I just feel like the field is definitely too immature to really like falsify anything. Even like like I suppose I've thought about this a little bit more, of course, with the replications as well, because even just I've completely moved away from the terms replication failure and success because there's no possible way to know which study was right. Was is the original effect true and the replication false then, or what? Because with our both our methods and our hypothesis, I think we're just some of the hypotheses, they're not empirical enough to be falsified, and
Mm.
then our methods are not transparent enough to know enough about the theory itself, or what our hypothesis is trying to build towards. That we're not building the, what's the word I'm looking for, kind of the, I suppose, the box of the theory. We don't know where the theory starts or ends sometimes with it, so therefore we don't know if, when we're doing replications from an original, what, there's always going to be some deviation, so like which deviations matter and things like that. But like, it's impossible to know that from a replication, and so it's just really difficult then to go on and interpret them.
I mean, this is where as well, I think we don't touch on it in much detail in this chapter, but in the following chapter, when we move on to discussing kind of theory testing, we kind of discuss this idea that, you have the kind of Duhem-Quine kind of thesis, as it's known, the kind of overdetermination of theory, that we can never test the theory either.
Mm.
Whenever we employ that kind of modus ponens structure, actually we don't ever get the nice, neat, kind of simple version of let's just start with the premise of the theory, because we have to start with the premise of the theory and then turn that into a model and now operationalize it. And as we go through these stages, we start adding in other premises that are auxiliary kind of premises about measurement tools and sampling distributions and other bits and bobs that start becoming other things that get tested as a conjunction of premises. So it makes it hard, it makes it difficult, it makes it messy and more interesting, I think. But
Yeah.
I realized in reflecting about this actually and looking at that kind of final figure, and I think this came because I gave a talk on this chapter this morning as a guest lecture for some master students, and I realized that there's a bit missing from that chapter as well, because I think that although I gave the example of starting with the premise in that kind of deductive um, inferential form, that the premise is, let's assume we have a scientific theory and it is true. What will we observe? Do we observe it? And then draw conclusions from that. Um, is that, if you were to take the kind of, stereotypical positivist view, in the sense that you're not really interested in theory in the sense that I've kind of presented it in that image, which is, underlying kind of unobservable causal powers and these sorts of things. But instead, you're quite happy saying, like, look, when I say theory, all I mean is just some way of describing a seemingly constantly occurring phenomena. Um, we've got this mathematical model, whether it's, statistical or deterministic or whatever. We're not going to make any strong claims about causes because Hume convinced us that, we can't observe those. So it doesn't make sense to think about them as being ontologically relevant. But you could still start with, even in the absence of strong theory, we might have a phenomena that we can derive a hypothesis from potentially, and that can be as simple as, some initial assumptions about, our smallest effect size of interest, and how we set that up as some sort of distributional parameter, and what that deductively will entail given how we kind of set up and operationalize our study. I guess that's when then we start then to move into the differences between the inferences we make regarding theory, into the statistical inferences we make regarding kind of observation, using data to draw inferences about, the phenomena and events that we think those data stem from. But I think, we can probably still do a little bit better than we are. And Zoltan Dinas has got a really nice paper with like and I talk about it a little bit in the second chapter, when talking about theory testing. If I remember rightly, I think the paper's just called "What Does My Theory Say?" or something. I think that's the title. What does my
Mhm.
theory say? Something like that. And you get some really nice, simple heuristics for saying, like, even if you've got like a fairly simple theory, like even if it's what seems like a loose verbal theory, if you sit down and think about it, it probably entails a certain set of observations and probably excludes a certain set of observations. And you can start to then think about, okay, even in the absence of, the types of strong theories that are common in fields like physics or, chemistry or biology or whatever, we can still start to think a little bit more carefully about, okay, if I make this assumption, what does that mean? What should that mean if that was true?
Hmm. I just with the obviously I'm doing all of my reading in terms of the replication crisis as well, and there was something I came across earlier, um and it was kind of basically that we like all of the things we focus on for kind of reform and just resolving the crisis of confidence are focused on methodological and statistical reform, are those kind of issues. And what was the paper? And it just basically was saying that we're essentially like ignoring blind spots still with our theory building. I can't remember exactly which paper. I think it might have been from Wiggins, the replication crisis in psychology. And if I try and remember off the top of my head, it essentially saying kind of in line with in line with objectivism, we're trying to kind of obtain the truth about the world using kind of, or trying to reduce our bias. That was it. We were trying to reduce our bias somehow by being more transparent, and kind of delving into more open science and things. But by being kind of more transparent, we're essentially having a bias against certain biases. So we have a bias against, for example, confirmation bias, but then we're trying to endorse some of our other values and beliefs, and that we kind of risk basically creating these blind spots for ourselves, even if our value is transparency, which we think is quite a good thing in reform, and that we should aim to try and kind of and continuously challenge our own values and biases to drive science, rather than trying to kind of aspire to be value or bias free, because that's completely not attainable. I
Yeah,
thought it was just
yeah,
really interesting, and I'd never thought about it kind of like that before. I don't know, does that
yeah.
even make sense?
I'm trying to kind of think through that. So the idea being that we are we well, maybe this comes a little bit back to I mean, one of the points that Barry Schwartz made in that paper where he laid out those intellectual virtues
Hmm.
is that one of the final ones is this idea of kind of wisdom, and he kind of talks about the
Oh, the
need
balance.
to constantly practice, acting on these virtues, but also reflecting on them continuously and thinking forwards about how we're going to try and act in the future, and recognizing when we are kind of um, putting too much emphasis on one at the expense of another,
Hmm.
for example.
Yeah.
And like you could take something like perseverance and courage as being important intellectual virtues, but we can take them too far, and at the expense of a love of truth, for example, when we get a bit blindsided and try to defend positions which against reasonable argumentation as to issues with our positions. Um, so I want is that sort of, do you think, what they're
Yeah,
kind of
I think
getting
that
at?
summarizes it pretty well. I suppose, obviously I know that it's not all positives to reform. It's always at kind of the risk of something else as well. But it was just interesting. Because I suppose I would have naively thought that value transparency, can only really be a positive thing, can't it really? But there's of course a bias within that itself. So that like if you're trying to commit to being objective, it doesn't remove your bias or values from research, but just kind of tends to change them a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting paper I mentioned in one of the footnotes as well, because um, the concept of like positionality is typically talked of more within qualitative research, and
Mm.
is linked to various kind of initiatives around DEI and representation and whatnot. But it was interesting to come across more kind of reasoned and thought out critical perspectives on the idea of positionality statements for things like individual characteristics, such as personal characteristics, social positions, and experiences
Mm.
and beliefs, and so on. And it kind of highlighted it was immediately, it was kind of obvious immediately when I kind of read it, but I went, didn't even think about that. Is that whilst we value transparency around all of these things, and we think we should be encouraging this kind of transparency regarding our positionality, because it might influence, particularly in qualitative research, but also in quantitative research, the way we go about doing our research, and therefore how
Mm.
people should potentially interpret what we present, and so on and so forth. Um, the fact of the matter is, like, we still have to do our research in this current social system and the social structures, and
Yeah.
with the various kind of existing kind of biases that certain people hold. And so part of the argument is, well, actually this could, for some people, put them at a disadvantage, because you don't necessarily know who is going to be trying to judge you on those characteristics in a negative light. Um,
Mhm.
and so, yeah, it's interesting to see that even for things that kind of, without too much thought, seem like immediately, obviously, kind of positive, can have unintended consequences as well if
Yeah.
we don't think about the broader kind of implications of them. Um, even if when you look at kind of like the Miltonian norms and stuff, obviously one of those is universalism, and this
Mm.
idea that independent of who you are, everyone can participate in science, and it's about the validity of your arguments, and so on and so forth, which in principle is lovely. I'm sure most people would be absolutely over the moon if that were the case, but it's not always the case. And so it is there's always potentially unintended consequences of the things we do. But this is why thinking about the values that we hold, and what motivates us, and the way we go about doing our research is important, I think, to reflect on continuously. And certainly within kind of like the broader reform movement, there, at least initially, not necessarily in recent years, but there's been a lack of focus on asking questions of, like, what is our research even of? Like, what do we, what are the sort of ontological positions we're taking here in terms of what we do? Is it about identifying effects? Are we trying to create theories? Are we just describing empirical regularities? What is it that we're actually doing? What are even the concepts that we're kind of trying to
Mm.
address in our research? We have this typical approach of kind of taking nouns and going, that's what we study. I study this noun, I study that noun. And it's like, well, what is that noun? Like, is that a real thing? Do you assume it's a real thing? Is that a testable way of carving up nature? And yeah, there's a lot of stuff, I think, that goes um under discussed within the broader sort of movement. And I guess kind of part of my, when we first sat down to kind of carve out this chapter, and we had obviously earlier meetings and things, Aimer and myself were both quite sort of adamant that some of this stuff needed to be put in there to even if it just kind of planted some seeds for people to start thinking about this and
Mm.
reflecting on it. And I'm absolutely over the moon if all that people get from the chapter is to go away, and it just prompts them to think and reflect a bit
Yeah.
on their positions. And maybe immediately they don't necessarily know where they sit or fully understand some of the concepts, but um, that seed will be there, and it will kind of keep growing, and eventually they'll
Yeah.
come back to it, and they'll cultivate it and think about it a bit more carefully. Um, at least when I'm teaching my undergrads some of this stuff, I that's the main outcome I can hope for, rather than them necessarily fully grasping the implications of it.
I would have loved to have like written a kind of my own position maybe like 2 years ago or something like that, 3 years ago, when I was very much at the initial stage of the PhD, because I think it would be a lot different from how I would write it now. I think perhaps towards the start of the PhD, of course I was, I think that obviously reform is a good thing in sports science, and I think replication is a really really important concept in sports science. But like, of course, like anything, there's um for want of a better word, pros and cons to it as well. I definitely see more of a balance now, I think, than I would have at the start of my PhD. So I'd love to have written a position statement 2 years ago, and compared to now, I think it'd be really interesting. But one thing that kind of struck me there is, especially when you're talking about like what are we even trying to research? What questions are we asking, or what do we even want to know? And I think that's really interesting as well, because I think sometimes we just research because we can, because like low hanging fruit, it's just there, it's easy to measure, it's easy to research. Like, for example, the use of GPS, we can measure so many metrics that we don't even stop to think about what research question we actually have. We're just measuring because why not? It's easy for us to access. But I definitely think to take a little bit of time and reflection would involve, would you say, doing a little bit more slow science? That if we are to try and formulate what we want to do properly, like, that really takes time, because it is where you need plenty of time for reflection. It's not like you're going to sit down in 30 minutes and be like, oh, start coming up with what do you think is a theory or a hypothesis. It just doesn't happen that way. It's a lot slower. So obviously, in order to do that, we probably need to work a little bit slower. But then, of course, in the current society norms in academia, that's not really possible then. So, like, what can we do to promote that, but not completely sink in terms of our own kind of individual goals or career goals? Like, that's the big tough one, isn't it? Trying to find the balance.
Yeah, definitely.
What do you do there? Is this something that maybe, like, unfortunately, you just kind of have to maybe push down the line, focus on a little bit earlier in your career, when you're little, or later in your career, sorry, when you're a little bit more stable? Like, everything as an early career pressure feels like, publish papers, deadlines, I have to get this done on this time. So where do you fit this all in?
Do you know what? It's interesting because I find myself more and more nowadays reflecting on the kind of the very privileged position I'm in to be able to kind of do things the way I do it. And I've got a number of kind of, irons in the fire now, which have been in there for a very long time. And I've just been slowly thinking carefully about what the hell it is I'm doing and how to do it best. It's been the better part of a decade that I've been thinking, what the hell even is effort? And I'm trying to study that. What is it? How do I measure it? But this is also where kind of like the ontological positions, I think, can change and epistemological positions can change the pace at which we do fit things. For someone like me who openly is quite happy to say, well, I position myself in that kind of critical realist lens. Sorry, I think, yeah, you trying to come in? Yeah, you are. Sorry, we
The
adopted a new
visitor.
cat on Sunday. Kiki, what are you doing? She's trying to get through the door. One sec.
No worries.
Kiki, do you want to come in? Do you
I
want to
am
come in?
aware as well, everybody, that I'm doing so much
No?
talking here.
I'll
So
leave the
if
door
anybody
cracked open
feels
for
like
you.
interrupting me, go ahead.
Bless her. She's we got her on Sunday, and so she's still sort of settling in, and she does like to. Do you want to come sit on my lap? No?
Show her
What are you
off to the
doing?
world, James.
What are you doing? No, don't jump up there. You made me lose my train of thought, but that's acceptable.
Maybe she
Cute
can give
cats.
us our views. You were
Yeah.
having a crisis about effort. What is effort?
Yeah, well, I guess that from my perspective, it's oh, that was it. So, I've had various debates and discussions with people, and at some point realized that we're kind of talking past one another because take even something as simple as like trying to understand and observe or gain some understanding of someone's perception of effort. You can give someone a scale and ask them to give you a number on it, but what is that? Like, you've got the empirical observation of you handed them
Hmm.
a scale or showed them a scale and they responded verbally with a number. But is that is that actually measuring the thing you think it's measuring? Do you even care? Like, are you just happy to go like, well, if I can reliably get a particular number, it doesn't matter if it
Mm.
really is measuring the thing I'm saying it's measuring. I'll just go with the kind of either constructivist lens or, maybe if I want to be positivist because it's generalizable, a regularly kind of observable phenomena. But I'm not going to make any commitments about what it is. It's just the operation that I've done, and that's the data that it produces, and that's fine. Um, and in those cases, I think it becomes a little bit easier to go, well, if you take a very strong kind of operationalist stance to it, that everything we do is all the concepts we deal with are defined by the operations we use to perform our empirical observations, then I think that actually does make things a little bit quicker and easier, because you just need to think carefully about the operations that you perform. Whereas
Mm.
when you then take a step back and think like, well, no, maybe I am trying to figure out, whether there really is even a thing called, insert noun, whatever it is that you're interested in. And that can send you down a kind of rabbit hole of thinking even more deeply about about things, and waste 10 years thinking deeply and not get very far with things. But then for me, like, I reflect on the fact that I'm able to do that. I'm in a secure academic position. I do various other projects kind of that I get to, collaborate with colleagues on. I published a load of crap research at the beginning of my career, looking back on it. And weirdly, I never know how I quite feel about that. Like, I look back at some of the stuff I did during my PhD, for example, and I think, yeah, some of it was good. There was some good thought there. There was some good ideas. I didn't, without realizing it, explicitly, I was kind of trying to engage in some theory building and trying to think through the implications of that and maybe how to test it. Didn't do a very good job of doing it, but I was kind of trying to do that. And I've published a lot of stuff and a lot of crappy stuff. I've been involved in a lot of papers that got retracted after we found out that a colleague was fabricating the data. Um, but I always find it kind of hard to kind of feel bad about it, because I always try to reflect on going, well, okay, what did I learn from that process?
Mm.
Um, and to maybe be a bit contrarian, we often kind of get pitched this dichotomy of like, well, you either do quality research or you do a high quantity of research. And I don't think it's as simple as that. Like, I think if people haven't, you should read Paul Meal's book, unpublished book, that was kind of posthumously collected together, The Seven Sacred Cows of Academia. And there's a chapter in there where he talks about this kind of false dichotomy, and says, you've kind of got to do the research to learn what goes well and what doesn't go well, and try and,
Mm.
figure out how to do it better to some extent. And I certainly think from, doing a lot, there's probably a lot of crap out there, and I don't know. At least for my my saving grace is that I'm not really working typically on topics that have got like really bad implications if I'm severely wrong. So
Mm.
so I could be somewhat kind of feel a bit more comfortable about the fact that, I don't know, maybe someone's doing one less set that they, would be optimal, of curls in the squat rack or whatever. Um, but yeah, I don't I guess what I'm waffling around is I don't really know what the solution is, because it's
Mm.
certainly there's a bigger systemic problem as well there, in that someone like me has been quite capable of getting to a position where I can sit and be philosophical and reflect and try and, and spend years doing stuff, and even spend years doing stuff that I don't publish in the traditional sense, but work on research projects and papers that I just throw out as preprints and keep as living documents and keep working on, and don't worry too much about whether it's contributing to my metrics or promotion opportunities or things like that. But for others, it's not as easy to be able to kind of do that sort
Mm.
of thing. So I mean, the advice I always give to my PhD students is, fortunately, a lot of them have wanted to go into kind of in more industry roles anyway. But when they want to step into academia, I always kind of try and encourage them to think about all of this and think about how to apply it, and do their best to reflect and do good work as they go through. But to kind of trade off and think about that kind of balance, and think about that kind of wisdom, virtue of wisdom, and balance up playing the game to the degree that they are comfortable doing so, given the knowledge that they now have, given that they get the curtain pulled when they come and join me to do a PhD. And more often than not, I think they do a pretty good job of it. Typically, my students have, in terms of playing the game a little bit, but really just trying to do good work and also being humble about the work that they're doing and what really it says and what really can be concluded from it. Hello, little girl.
Yeah. I think like the PhD is obviously an interesting time because you have a lot of time on one project, and as long as your PhD is feasible to get done within your allocated funding time, then you do have time for reflection, because you're trying to create your literature review. So you're doing a lot of reading, so therefore you're spending a lot of time reflecting as well. So like potentially, instead of, as you say, it shouldn't have to feel like two extremes. You're either doing like high quality research or like just publishing loads. Like they don't have to be two ends of a scale, or they're not necessarily opposite things either. But potentially they're like, it'd be nice if there was something that could try to kind of feed into the sports science education system, whether that begins, it's there, I feel like sometimes there's more restriction at an undergraduate level because you're trying to teach a research methods course sometimes in 8 weeks, which is like absolutely crazy. So I think there is less flexibility there almost because it's just kind of a means to an end for the exam. But with the PhD, I think there is an opportunity to kind of potentially add a little bit more of this kind of thinking or reflection into a PhD. There's the most flexibility with it. It differs between projects as well. And I think that would definitely shape like your ideas going forward. I think if you could learn how to do this, like, the PhD is a time for honing your skills as a researcher, but not just, what we consider like, well, not just what we think the skills are. Obviously, critical thinking is a really important skill as well that we probably don't even consciously give enough thought to during our PhD. So like I think the PhD would be a really nice time to try and incorporate some of these thoughts, because I was just having a little think about this, and how like the foundations of scientific research is not really included in undergraduate or even master education. So where does it go? And that's what I was thinking earlier, that it doesn't fit anywhere in the restriction of semesters for undergraduate research. So maybe it'd be nicer to put it in a little bit more of a place where you have flexibility. And that's what I really liked about your chapter as well, is that I wasn't just reading a chapter and trying to kind of to learn terms, to learn what does axiology mean, or learn about the different viewpoints. Okay, so what does this mean exactly? The exercises throughout, and just in general, kind of some of the questions you were asking back to the reader just caused a lot more reflection. And I think that was the sign of the good chapter for me. That's why I really loved it so much, because I was thinking about the chapter when I wasn't reading the chapter, so it just allowed me to have that reflection. And even though it seems like such a normal, natural thing to do when you're doing research is to reflect, I just don't think we do enough of it or allow enough time for ourselves. We constantly think if we're not doing something physical or getting through data sets that it's not work, but reflection is work too, and we need to prioritize it as well.
Definitely, yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing as well is, the chapter's not just aimed at students. I think all of us probably need to think more carefully and reflect on these things. And so, if there are students listening, give a copy to your supervisors as well, if they're not already thinking about these sorts of things or encouraging you to do so.
Yeah, like I'd really love to, because I've thought a lot, of course, about what I'm going to do after my PhD, and now that I'm coming to the end of it. And like I do love education. I love teaching people what I'm learning too, but just the thought of, especially like because my PhD is research methods, coming into that background, and the thought of potentially going into a role like that and trying to teach that in a really short space of time kind of scares me a little. And I'm like, I don't know, do I want to do that and just cut corners or something, with what I'm trying to teach? but because you're trying to teach everything, but in such a short space of time. So I think it would be so nice, and obviously this research methods book is such a great starting point. But I think it would be so nice to have a individualized platform for sports and exercise science students where they could go and learn about these things in a way that is related to sports science. Because again, as I mentioned earlier in the call, sometimes you just don't think about this in the sports science complex if there or idea if there isn't a sports science example. That's why I was kind of hammering home that to you a lot. We need sports science examples so people actually think, oh, this is relevant to me. Zach, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I have to jump in another meeting. So before I go, I would like to give some of my feedback to you. So it was a well-written piece, a little bit heavy for my preference. So I would say that if we want to take that information and actually use it for our students, it needs to go like a tone down, so it is more easily to be digested for the undergrad, especially. I mean, as James said, I'm teaching also research methods and stats in my classes, and what I do in order to get them an idea how to take knowledge from other courses to my course and how to learn how to do the good research. They have to read. They have to read other papers. They have to read like different writers and get their writing style, but also they need to have the theory behind it. So that document is really good, okay? But again, as I said, I think it's a bit heavy and it has too much knowledge, much theory over there. So maybe different pieces, maybe a little bit lighter as a reading. It will be better, okay, to serve our needs as professors. Then the other thing about what you publish, actually I had today an early meeting about the publish or perish, and we all know that this is something that we have to do. You want to get a promotion and you need to have publications. But not all the institutions actually value the publication based on the impact factor that they have. Right now, we have the Kardashian Index that many of the universities, they check this one as, you're very popular, so you're going to get a promotion. So it's very difficult for us, okay? What comes down is how we value our science, okay? And then, James, you said that in the beginning of your career, you did like crap of research. No, I don't think that anything is crap. We do because we do it with our best of interest. With the knowledge that we have, right? And as we progress as professors, like educators, we learn more, we never stop learning, and we improve ourselves. So I'm very proud for my early research. Right now I go back and I check my own writing and I say, oh, did I write this? My goodness, that was awful. But this is the progress, okay? So I think everybody's doing a great job. Keep doing whatever we're doing. And see you in our next meeting.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach. Yeah, good okay. Positive way to finish that.
Yeah, okay. Take care, guys. Sorry, I have to go. Care. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Yeah, that's some useful points there. Obviously, I struggle myself with teaching this, and by no means do I think I am an expert at teaching these topics either, particularly to undergrads. But what have I done? I've got some controversial ideas about ways I want to kind of structurally change things, at least at our institution. I think the vast majority of students don't want to go into. I kind of differentiate between knowledge production and knowledge consumption in a sense, and I think there would be some value allowing students on courses where they can choose pathways and modules and tracks and things like that to make the conscious choice as to whether they want to go down the I want to become a knowledge producer versus I want to be someone who is an informed consumer of knowledge, and to then be able to tailor the content and the delivery more to an engaged audience in that way, because I would suspect that the vast majority would not choose to do a research project if given the option of doing something else. So I think there's kind of some potential for that, but it's tough. It's so ingrained that you have to do it. It's kind of like a rite of passage. You do your undergrad dissertation, you master's thesis or whatever. But unless you're going down that route, there's part of me that wonders the value of it versus potentially more directly trying to educate students around these ideas, but in a way that is tailored towards, like, you're going to go out and become a practitioner who is going to be an active consumer of this knowledge. How do you interpret that and then apply that and use that well, versus, what things do you need to think about when you are, a producer of that knowledge? And I think kind of having those tracks would allow, again, you to focus a little bit more on certain things and think a bit more carefully about how to tailor and deliver it. Because certainly at the moment, my kind of strategy has partly been to temper my expectations about what is achievable, slowly over time. And like I say, if I can introduce the ideas and prompt reflection and thinking, then that's my kind of threshold normally, at least with this topic, with the students. So far I think I've kind of achieved that, but it's never easy to determine.
And how much time do you have for teaching? Like, would say how many semesters would you have the same class to teach this?
So at the moment, this is crammed into one semester, and so they do a on our courses. They do a basic kind of first year module, which is really, it's called kind of research methods, but it's sort of more like an introduction to, hey, you're at university, you need to reference things, you need to learn how to cite things, you need to learn how to look for information on this database, and we're going to do a couple of weeks of teaching you what a mean is, and some very, very basic stuff, and it's almost kind of aimed at making sure everyone is at a base level before they then go into the second and third years. Then they meet me in their second year and wonder what the hell happened. Did they pick the right course? But yeah, we currently also have the structure where it's very hard to teach them the ideas, because they are so focused on the assessment mode, which is in their second year, they develop and write their proposal, but they also have to work with a supervisor to do that. And they very quickly figure out that they could not turn up to any of the classes and just go have some meetings with their supervisor and create a passable proposal with them. Although I've made some changes this year to try and make it a lot more structured for them, so that they kind of feel like if they don't come to class, they're going to miss something very important. But even then, like at the moment, I cover maybe 1 to 2 weeks of this sort of stuff with them. And we've made a few changes to try and rein them in a little bit as well, because historically they were always given like completely full rein to come up with whatever research ideas they want to, which inevitably means most of them either struggle to come up with an idea because they've not got a broad enough awareness of what currently exists and what is worth actually pursuing. I always try and encourage them to think about potential for replication projects. But now we've kind of limited a little bit more so that we can focus a bit more of the teaching around kind of, okay, you can either do a descriptive project, an experimental project, you can, but they've got to fit within these constraints because they've got to be delivered in this period of time. And they'll get taught a little bit more about other kind of study designs and approaches that they can take. But by and large, it's kind of restricted a little bit. But what we're going to be moving to in a couple of years' time, we've had it all validated, but it doesn't start until 2025, I think. 25, 26 year is we're going to remove the proposal from their second year, because also they don't buy into it enough at that time, because it seems so far off that their dissertation is. So they generally don't, with the exception of some of them, that they generally don't do like a really good job of it, and then they come in, they've kind of forgotten about it, they don't really know or care about it. So instead we're going to focus the research methods more around teaching some of the key ideas and focusing a little bit more about that kind of consumption of informed consumption of research and knowledge. And then in their final year, we are going to be getting them to all work on collaborative group projects. so that they can kind of appreciate the fact that, you know, the vast majority of work nowadays is collaborative. And they'll be formatively assessed. In the first semester, they work as a group with their supervisor to develop a group project. They'll be formatively assessed on the proposal that they develop. And then to avoid issues of like plagiarism and collusion, because they'll be working on a group project, we're going to be assessing them by a viva. So
Oh,
just like
okay.
a PhD. So they've got to write essentially like a 3,000 word kind of basically short report of their project. You know, I guess like you'd see like a kind of brief note or whatever in the paper type in various journals. So the supervisor has something to read and then base their kind of viva around, but they'll all be individually assessed via viva. And then that also means as well, instead of kind of the usual approach for group projects, which is let's give them all a different DV to work on, and you know, and you end up with this kind of like weird chimera of a project where they just let's look at this as an outcome. Let's look at this. Instead, they can kind of plan a project around one key question. They can think about, right, let's figure out how we design and sample for a project that's based around this. And then I'm also going to give the opportunity for students in following years to then, if they want to, take on previous year's projects to extend and continue the sample size until they've reached, you know, whatever is appropriate to
Yeah.
answer those questions. So this is my kind of like ideal world of maybe we'll actually get some slow, good projects done over
Yeah.
time, but also kind of fits the bill of exposing the students to how research should work, and
Yeah.
also assess them in a way that means that they can't cheat.
It kind of imitates a bit more real life research as well, as you're saying, with the collaboration as well. And that is nice that it could be a continuation of the project. So you're not just turning out small projects with small sample sizes.
Yeah, exactly. So
And I
yeah,
obviously think the idea of like running replications is interesting as part of Find Your Projects. Obviously, you know, I'm going to promote replications. I think the one thing I suppose about doing them as part of a Find Your Project that I was just thinking there as you were saying that is that it probably doesn't help them with those skills of developing a hypothesis, or kind of maybe thinking about their theory. I suppose they do think if they are doing a replication, they might think about it in terms of, you know, the boundaries of the effect. So they are thinking a little bit, I suppose, about the events or phenomena that could affect the theory, but it's not really helping them with those skills with hypothesis or theory development. So that would be the kind of one, I suppose, con of running replications as part of final year projects, wouldn't it?
yeah, potentially. I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to sort of develop at the moment is a Viva structure for, because we've obviously got a big cohort of supervisors, and not all of them will necessarily, if I leave them to their own kind of devices, they won't necessarily ask the questions that I think they should probably be asking to examine those kind of learning outcomes. But even for something like replication projects, I think you know, the students will need to be able to at Viva discuss how those ideas were developed by the original researchers, you know,
Okay.
whether they are testing theories, how those hypotheses developed and stuff. And that would be my kind of intention with it. So even if they don't necessarily like come up with it themselves, they've still got to kind of understand that exegesis of the original research that they are looking to replicate, and
Hmm.
you know, also be able to um, express why it's important to do that.
Yeah, that's true. That would be a good idea or a good way of kind of helping them with those skills then.
Yeah.
I've just realized the time actually, so I'm going to, if
Oh
anybody
yeah.
doesn't have any final questions, I'm going to stop the recording. And thank you all for attending.